welcome. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Or, I might show up at your door. I'm just here to share some creepy stories, so sit back and enjoy. Disclaimer: the content presented in the video is purely for entertainment purposes only. The theories and stories discussed in this video are speculative and are not supported by any evidence or proof. Viewer discretion is advised. I always thought the night shift was supposed to be peaceful. Quiet halls, an empty parking lot, nothing but the occasional raccoon setting off a motion sensor. That was why I took this job. Security guard at an industrial facility on the outskirts of town. Decent pay, long hours, but almost no real work. Most nights, all I had to do was sit in the office, check the cameras, and take a few rounds through the building. But tonight was different. I was halfway through my shift when the first emergency alert interrupted the local radio station. The static cut through the low hum of music, followed by the unmistakable chime of an ES warning. I turned up the volume, expecting to hear about a missing person or a tornado warning. Instead, the mechanical voice read out a strange and unsettling message. Emergency alert. This is a national emergency. Avoid all moving shadows. Do not attempt to interact with them. Seek shelter in a well-lit area. Further instructions will follow. I frowned. The message repeated twice before the station resumed its broadcast, as if nothing had happened. What the hell was that? I pulled out my phone and checked the news, but there was nothing about a national emergency. Just the usual garbage, celebrity gossip, politics, weather forecasts. No breaking news about shadows of all things. A prank? A system error? I didn't have much time to think about it before Marco, one of the other guards on shift, poked his head into the office. "You hear that weird-ass alert just now?" he asked, chewing on a toothpick. "Yeah," I said. "You think it's real?" Marco scoffed. "Come on, man. Avoid moving shadows? What's next? Stay indoors or Slenderman's gonna get us." He shook his head. "Probably some hacker messing with the EAS." That sounded reasonable enough. The emergency alert system had been hacked before. Back in 2013, a Montana TV station accidentally aired a fake warning about a zombie outbreak. This could be another hoax. Still, something about the calm, robotic voice unsettled me. I shrugged it off and got back to my rounds. The facility was massive, a mix of warehouses and office spaces, all dimly lit at night. The overhead lights in the halls flickered every now and then, but that was normal. As I walked, I checked my phone again. That's when I got a text from my brother. "Zach, 11:48 p.m. Yo, have you seen the news? People are freaking out." I typed a response. "Me? About what?" "The emergency alert." "Zach, yeah, dude. People are saying it's real." I stopped walking. A bad feeling settled in my gut. "Me? What do you mean real?" "Zach, check the forums. People are saying they've seen it." My heart beat a little faster as I switched to Reddit. There were dozens of new posts flooding the front page. "WTF is happening? Just saw my neighbor's shadow move when he wasn't moving. My friend disappeared. I swear to God, the last thing I saw was his shadow stretching toward him. Is this a joke? My security cam just recorded something I can't explain." I tapped one of the posts. Someone had uploaded a grainy video from their front porch. It showed a man standing outside his house, smoking a cigarette. Nothing seemed off until I noticed his shadow. First, it looked normal, but then it moved just a slight twitch against the direction of the light source. The man didn't notice. The shadow twitched again. Then it stretched toward him. He must have felt something because he turned around. The second he did, the screen glitched out, and when the footage resumed, the man was gone. Only his shadow remained, frozen in place. I locked my phone and took a shaky breath. This had to be fake, right? The facility's PA system crackled to life, making me jump. Marco's voice echoed through the halls. "Hey, anyone else getting another alert?" It just popped up on my phone. A second later, my own phone buzzed. "Emergency alert. This is not a test. Shadows have been observed moving independently of their source. Do not make physical contact with any moving shadow. Seek shelter immediately. My stomach dropped. The radio alert could have been a hoax. The Reddit posts could have been fake. But this came straight from the government. The overhead lights in the hallway flickered. My shadow stretched unnaturally for just a second before snapping back to normal. I froze. Did I just imagine that? A loud clatter echoed from the warehouse section of the facility. I instinctively reached for my flashlight but hesitated. The emergency alert said to avoid moving shadows, but it didn't say what would happen if you shined a light on them. I made my way toward the sound. Marco stood near the warehouse entrance, staring at something on the floor. When I got closer, I saw what it was. A flashlight, rolling in slow circles like someone had just dropped it. "Where's Jess?" Marco asked, his voice tight. Jess was one of the newer guards. She was supposed to be patrolling this area. I stepped forward and stopped. There was a shadow on the ground. It looked like a person's shadow, but there was no one there. It was perfectly still except for the head. The head twitched as if looking around. Marco took a shaky step back. "Dude, what the fuck?" I grabbed his arm. "We need to get inside. Now." We backed away slowly, keeping our eyes on the shadow. It remained frozen in place. Then, just as we reached the door, it twitched again, this time facing us. The overhead lights flickered out. The warehouse plunged into darkness. The last thing I saw was the shadow rushing toward us. The warehouse plunged into darkness. For a second, neither Marco nor I moved. The only sound was the faint hum of the building's ventilation system and the pounding of my heartbeat in my ears. Then Marco broke the silence. "Run!" I didn't hesitate. We bolted toward the security office, our footsteps slamming against the concrete floor. Behind us, something moved. Not footsteps, a dragging sound, like fabric being pulled across the floor. I didn't dare look back. We burst into the security office, and I immediately slammed the door shut and locked it. Marco collapsed into the chair by the monitors, breathing hard. "Tell me you saw that," he gasped. I could barely get the words out. "Yeah, I saw it." The emergency generator kicked in a second later, and the backup lights flickered on. For a moment, everything looked normal. The facility was dimly lit. The security monitors showed empty hallways, and the shadows cast by the flickering bulbs were still. But I wasn't convinced. Marco sat forward and switched camera feeds. "Where's Jess?" I already knew the answer, but I checked anyway. The last footage of her was in Warehouse 3. She had been walking toward the loading dock, her flashlight beam bouncing as she moved. Then, without warning, the screen glitched out. When the feed returned, she was gone. Only her shadow remained, still stretched across the floor. Neither of us spoke. We just stared at the screen, the realization sinking in. Jess was gone. Another alert buzzed on my phone. Marco's did the same. We both grabbed them, dreading what we'd see. Emergency alert. Power failures reported in multiple counties. Shadows are behaving abnormally. Do not stand near any shadow that does not belong to you. If you see a moving shadow, evacuate immediately. My stomach dropped. "Jesus Christ," Marco muttered. "The power failures, are they doing it on purpose?" I had the same thought. If shadows needed light to exist, then maybe the government was shutting down power grids to stop whatever was happening. Before I could answer, a noise crackled through the office. The radio, it was playing distorted voices, overlapping and choppy, as if multiple people were speaking at once. At first, I couldn't make out the words. Then I did. "Stay out of the light. Do not run. It sees you." Marco turned the radio off. "Nope, nope, nope." He turned to me, his face pale. "What the hell is happening?" I didn't have an answer, but I had a terrifying thought. The shadow in the warehouse, it had noticed us. It had turned toward us. That meant it was aware. I swallowed hard and turned back to the monitors. The shadow was still there, frozen in place. But now that I looked closer, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. It was bigger than before, not longer like a normal shadow stretching from a change in the light. Bigger, like it had grown. I felt sick. "Ethan," Marco said quietly. Check the parking lot. I switched feeds. At first, the cameras showed the same empty lot as usual. The facility was isolated, surrounded by trees and open land. But something was off. The floodlights that normally illuminated the lot were dimmer than usual, flickering slightly. And in those flickers, I saw them. Shadows. Dozens of them. They shifted when the lights flickered, moving in unnatural ways. Some stretched long across the pavement, only to contract sharply, as if snapping back into place. Others twitched violently, out of sync with the wind and the surrounding objects. Marco swore under his breath. Tell me that's a camera glitch. I wanted to, but I couldn't. Instead, I switched to the highway camera feed. My blood went cold. The road leading to the facility was lined with abandoned cars, some with doors still open, as if their owners had fled mid-drive. The streetlights flickered, casting erratic shadows across the pavement. There were no people, just shadows. Some of them were moving. Marco pushed back from the desk, rubbing his hands over his face. Nope, I'm done. We're leaving. Right now. I almost agreed with him. Almost, but something was wrong. I looked back at the monitor showing the warehouse. The shadow that had been stationary for the past few minutes had moved. Only slightly, but enough for me to notice. It had inched closer to the security door. I took a shaky breath. I don't think we can leave. Marco frowned. What? I pointed at the monitor. They're watching us. As if on cue, the overhead lights flickered again. And in that brief moment of darkness, the shadow in the warehouse shifted forward. Closer. Marco grabbed my shoulder. Dude, we have to go. I shook my head. If we run, we'll be outside. I switched feeds again, this time to the lobby entrance. The glass doors leading outside were pitch black. The floodlights outside should have cast some light in, but they weren't, as if something was blocking them. Marco was shaking now. Okay. So what do we do? Just sit here until what? The military comes? What if they don't come? I didn't have an answer. The radio crackled again. They are learning. Do not trust your own shadow. A chill ran down my spine. I glanced down at the floor. My own shadow, cast by the dim emergency lights, looked normal. But how could I be sure? Marco grabbed a flashlight from the desk. Screw this. I'm getting out of here. Marco, but he was already moving. He switched on the flashlight, and the moment he did, something moved behind him. A shadow detached from the wall, long and formless at first, then shifting into something vaguely human-shaped. Marco didn't see it. He was too busy unlocking the door. I lunged forward and yanked him back. The shadow lunged too, but the door swung open, breaking the light beam, and it vanished. Marco fell back, swearing. What the hell was that? I slammed the door shut again. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know what these things were, but I knew one thing. They weren't just shadows. They were something else, and they were getting closer. I pressed my back against the door, my breathing heavy. Marco sat on the floor, rubbing his face with his hands. Neither of us spoke for a moment. We didn't have to. We both knew the truth now. This wasn't a hoax. It wasn't a system error. Something was out there. Something was hunting us. Marco exhaled sharply and pushed himself up. Okay. What now? I forced myself to think. The security office was small. Just a desk, a couple of chairs, and a row of monitors showing different parts of the facility. No windows, one door, a good place to hide, a terrible place to escape from. I checked the cameras again, scanning every inch of the facility. The shadows were still there, moving in ways that defied logic. Some stretched across the walls even though there was no visible light source. Others clung to objects like oil stains that pulsed and shifted. But something else caught my attention. The main entrance. The glass doors leading outside had been completely overtaken by darkness. It wasn't just a lack of light. It was like something was actively blocking it out. I swallowed hard. I think we're trapped. Marco laughed dryly. No shit. He paced back and forth. Look, man, we can't just sit here. What if the power goes out again? What if? The radio crackled to life? They are listening. "Do not speak too loudly." Marco and I froze. The distorted voice wasn't from any station I recognized. It was calm, almost detached. "Shadows are mimicking movement. Do not trust what you see." I grabbed the radio and tried switching channels, but it didn't respond. The voice continued as if it hadn't noticed me. "If your shadow moves when you don't, you are already dead." Then static. I slowly turned to Marco. His face was pale. "Okay," he whispered. "I'm officially freaking out." I checked the monitors again, my pulse hammering in my ears. The shadow from the warehouse had disappeared, but that didn't mean it was gone. Then I saw something worse. The shadow in the lobby, the one that had been blocking the glass doors, it was inside now. A long, twisting shape stretched across the floor, crawling up the walls like a living stain. It pulsed and flickered as the emergency lights struggled to illuminate it. And then it moved, not just a little, it lunged. The security feed glitched violently as the shadow stretched toward the nearest camera, and the screen cut to static. I shot to my feet. "They're inside," Marco swore. Nope. We need to get out of here. Right now." "How?" I snapped. "The second we step into the hallway, we're dead." Marco gritted his teeth. "We need light. More than just these emergency lamps. If we can stay in the brightest part of the facility, maybe they can't reach us." He had a point. The shadows had only moved in dimly lit areas. I scanned the blueprints on the wall. "The break room," I said. "It's got those giant fluorescent lights. If they're still working, it might be the safest place." Marco nodded. "All right, we move fast, we stay together, and we don't stop for anything." "Got it." I swallowed hard. "Got it." I unlocked the door and slowly pushed it open. The hallway was dimly lit, the flickering bulbs overhead barely holding on. The shadows along the walls looked normal, but I wasn't sure anymore. Were they really just shadows, or were they waiting? We moved carefully, step by step. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. A noise echoed from somewhere behind us. A whisper. I turned my head slightly. Marco did the same. The hallway behind us was empty, but I swore I saw a flicker of movement in the corner of my eye. Marco grabbed my wrist. "Don't look. Keep moving." I forced myself to focus on the hallway ahead. The break room was close, just past the next set of doors. If we could make it, then the overhead lights cut out. Darkness. I barely had time to react before something slammed into me. I hit the ground hard, my breath leaving me in a choked gasp. The air turned freezing cold, like I had just stepped into a frozen lake. I saw nothing. Total blackness. Then movement. Something shifted in the dark, circling me. My hands scrambled for my flashlight, but my fingers were numb, sluggish. The darkness moved again, and then a hand grabbed my arm. Not a shadow, not a monster. Marco. His flashlight blazed to life, and suddenly the thing was gone. The emergency lights flickered back on. I sucked in a ragged breath. I had fallen right next to a shadow, and it had been reaching for me, twitched slightly as if it had just missed its chance. Marco pulled me up. Come on. We sprinted down the hall, not stopping until we slammed through the doors into the break room. The overhead fluorescent lights buzzed loudly, casting harsh white light over the entire space. No shadows, no dark corners, just bright, sterile safety. Marco locked the door behind us, breathing hard. I collapsed into one of the chairs, my whole body shaking. For now, we were safe, but something wasn't right. I turned my head slightly, my gaze catching the floor. Marco's shadow stretched across the tiles, cast perfectly by the fluorescent light. And then it twitched. Marco wasn't moving, but his shadow was, and it was turning toward me. I stopped breathing. Marco's shadow twitched again. A tiny, unnatural movement that had nothing to do with him. It shifted slightly toward me, like it had just noticed I was watching. I gripped the chair's armrest so hard my knuckles went white. Marco was standing perfectly still. His chest rose and fell with deep, panicked breaths, his body tense from the sprint. But his shadow was breathing differently, slower, more controlled, like it was pretending to match him. I tried to swallow my fear, but my throat was too dry. I needed to think fast. If I said something, would it react? If I didn't, would it know I'd figured it out? Marco wiped sweat from his forehead. Okay, he panted. We made it. I didn't answer, couldn't, because in the corner of my eye, his shadow had turned its head. I forced myself to stay calm, to act like I hadn't seen it. Marco finally noticed my silence and frowned. Dude, you good? I nodded too quickly.
Yeah.
Just catching my breath. Marco sighed and rubbed his face. Man, we are so screwed. He slumped into the chair across from me, running a hand through his hair. Jess is gone. Those things are everywhere. And we don't even know what the hell they want. I barely heard him. I was too busy watching his shadow. It had stopped copying him. Marco leaned forward, elbows on his knees. His shadow? It stayed perfectly still. A second too late, it followed. I had to get out of here. I had to get away from whatever was standing in front of me. But if I moved too suddenly, would it react? Would it lunge? I felt sweat bead on my forehead. I couldn't make it obvious. I forced myself to breathe, to steady my voice. We should check the cameras again. Marco nodded and stood up. His shadow didn't. It stayed seated for half a second longer before suddenly jerking upright. My stomach twisted into a tight knot. Marco didn't notice. He just stretched his arms, groaning. Yeah, good idea. Let's make sure nothing's gotten inside. It already had. I swallowed hard and stood too. My legs felt shaky, but I forced myself to act normal, to act like I hadn't noticed. The second we stepped toward the break room door, the fluorescent lights flickered, just once, barely a second, but it was enough. I saw it. Marco's shadow wasn't connected to his feet anymore. It was a few inches off the ground, as if it had momentarily detached from him during the flicker and then snapped back into place. I clenched my jaw. I wasn't in the room with Marco anymore. I was in the room with something else. I had to get out. We reached the door, and I grabbed the handle. My skin felt clammy, my pulse hammering in my ears. Let's move fast, Marco said. I nodded. Yeah. I opened the door, stepping out into the dim hallway, and then I slammed it shut behind me, locking Marco inside. A furious pounding erupted from the other side instantly. Ethan, what the hell, man? Open the door. I staggered back, my breath coming in quick, panic gasps. You're not Marco. Silence. Then a laugh. Quiet, wrong-sounding laugh. Ah. The voice on the other side said, So you saw it. I felt my stomach drop. It wasn't even trying to sound like him anymore. The pounding stopped, and then I heard movement inside the room. A wet, stretching noise. A sound like skin peeling away. I ran. I didn't care where. I just knew I had to get away from that door before whatever was in there came out. I tore through the facility, my feet slamming against the cold concrete floor. I had no plan, no idea where to go. I just needed distance. As I rounded a corner, I caught sight of a flickering monitor on the wall. One of the security feeds, the parking lot camera. I skidded to a stop. The shadows were still moving outside, slithering across the pavement like living ink. Some stretched unnaturally between abandoned cars, pulsing with every flicker of the faulty floodlights. But there was something else now. A man. He was standing in the middle of the lot, staring directly at the camera. Not moving, not blinking. His shadow stretched long behind him, twisting unnaturally even though there was no wind. And then he smiled. The camera feed cut to static. I stumbled back, my pulse thundering in my skull. What the hell was that? I barely had time to process it before I heard footsteps. Behind me, slow, deliberate. I turned around too fast, my vision spinning. The hallway was empty, but the shadows, they were longer than before. The emergency lights flickered again, and the shadows moved. Not in a normal way, not in a way light should allow. They reached for me. I bolted. I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs ached. I didn't stop, didn't turn around. I knew if I did, I'd see something I wasn't supposed to. I needed to get out of here, but I couldn't go outside. I couldn't trust anyone. I was completely alone. I reached a locked storage room, my fingers trembling as I fumbled with the keycard in my pocket. Behind me, the shadows shifted, crawling across the floor. I swiped the card. The door unlocked. I threw myself inside and slammed it shut behind me. For now, I was safe, but I knew the truth now. They were inside, and they were getting smarter. I pressed my back against the storage room door, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I listened. The hallway outside was silent, but I knew better. They were out there, moving, waiting. The emergency alerts had said to avoid shadows, but they hadn't said how. They hadn't said what happens if you fail. And now Marco was gone. I clenched my fists trying to push that thought away. Marco was never Marco. The second his shadow started moving on its own, he was already, no, focus. I scanned the storage room. It was small, barely big enough for the metal shelves lining the walls, stacked high with cleaning supplies and spare equipment. One flickering overhead light cast harsh white illumination across the space. I checked the floor. My shadow stretched in front of me, perfectly normal. For now, I needed a plan. The monitors outside had shown something. A man in the parking lot. The only person I'd seen since this nightmare started. He had looked right at the camera, smiling. That wasn't normal. That wasn't human. But maybe he knew something. Maybe he wasn't afraid of them. The thought made my skin crawl. Was he with them? Or something worse? I had to find out. I inhaled shakily and reached for my flashlight. It wasn't much, but it was the only defense I had. Then I opened the door. The hallway was different. I didn't notice it at first, but the second I stepped out, I felt it. The air was heavier. Wrong. The overhead emergency lights flickered in slow pulses, casting the hallway in rhythmic bursts of brightness and shadow. The movement was dizzying. I moved carefully, stepping toward the security room. Every flicker of light sent my shadow stretching out, then snapping back as the brightness returned. I gritted my teeth, trying to ignore the panic rising in my chest. Don't look at them. Don't focus on them. Just keep moving. I reached the security room door and peered inside. The monitors were still running. Some showed the hallways, others the warehouse floor. But one screen was still static. The parking lot feed. I hesitated, then flipped the switch to rewind the footage. For a moment, nothing happened. The static rolled backward. Then the screen cleared. The man was still standing there, exactly where I had last seen him. Same blank expression, same twisted smile. But now, I noticed something else. His shadow. It wasn't connected to him. It was standing beside him, watching him. I sucked in a breath. That wasn't possible. That wasn't how shadows worked. But as the footage played, I saw it. His shadow moved first. It turned toward the camera before he did, like it knew it was being watched. I swallowed hard and clenched my jaw. He wasn't normal, but he was my only lead. I had to get to the parking lot. The moment I stepped outside, the temperature plunged. The air was thick, suffocating, like the atmosphere had been sucked away. The fluorescent floodlights flickered overhead, barely holding back the consuming darkness beyond the pavement. The man was still there, standing perfectly still in the center of the lot. His grin widened as he saw me. I took slow steps forward, gripping my flashlight tight enough to hurt. The man tilted his head slightly, as if amused. "You're not supposed to be out here," he said. His voice was too smooth, too controlled. I forced myself to speak. "What are you?" His smile didn't waver, but his shadow twitched. It had moved again before he did. His eyes followed my gaze, and for the first time, his smile faded. "Ah," he said softly. "You noticed." A long silence stretched between us. The air felt wrong, like reality itself was bending around him. I took another step forward, my heart hammering. "Tell me what's happening. What are they?" The man exhaled, his breath fogging in the frigid air. "They are old," he said. "Older than light. Older than anything you've ever feared." His shadow shifted again. This time it was subtle, just a flicker, a fraction of a second delay before mimicking his posture. "They were here before the first sunrise," he continued. "And when the last light dies, they will remain." A deep chill settled in my bones. I tried to process his words, but all I could focus on was his shadow. It had moved again, but this time it wasn't mimicking him anymore. It was watching me. The man's expression darkened. "You're running out of time." My fingers tightened around my flashlight, Time for what? The overhead floodlights flickered violently. The darkness around us lurched forward, like a living thing trying to swallow us whole. The man stepped back. For the first time, his calm demeanor cracked. "They know you can see them now," he murmured. "That changes things." I stepped back too, suddenly feeling exposed. "Tell me how to stop them." The man's grin returned, but this time it was wrong. "You don't," he said, and then his shadow attacked him. It happened too fast. One moment, the shadow stood beside him. The next, it wrapped around him like a living thing, tendrils of darkness climbing his skin. He didn't scream, he just smiled wider, too wide, and then he was gone, swallowed, erased. The darkness lurched toward me next. I barely had time to react before I turned and ran. The shadows chased me, surging across the pavement like a flood. The flickering lights struggled to hold them back, casting only momentary flashes of safety. I reached the door, throwing myself inside just as the floodlights cut out completely. Darkness swallowed the parking lot, and outside I heard whispers. I collapsed against the wall, my breath coming in sharp, panicked gasps. The shadows had taken him. They were learning, and now they knew I could see them. The rules had changed, and I was next. I sat against the cold wall, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Outside, the floodlights were dead. Beyond the metal door, the parking lot was pure darkness. A living, shifting thing, whispering against the edges of reality. The shadows had swallowed the man, erased him, and now they knew I could see them. I clenched my fists, trying to push the panic down. Think, focus. I wasn't safe here. If they could move freely in the dark, then I was only alive because of the weak emergency lights inside the building. But those wouldn't last forever. I had to find a way to fight back. I forced myself to my feet. My body ached from exhaustion, my nerves fried, but I couldn't stop now. Stopping meant dying. I turned toward the hallway, then froze. The shadows in the corner twitched. It was slight, almost imperceptible, but I saw it. A sliver of darkness out of place, bending in a way that didn't match the overhead lights. It was watching me. My heartbeat pounded in my ears. I slowly reached into my pocket and pulled out my flashlight, and then I turned it on. A narrow beam of light sliced through the dim hallway, landing directly on the shifting shadow. It recoiled, not like an ordinary shadow, not like something harmless. It jerked away, twisting unnaturally, like a wounded thing scrambling to escape. My breath hitched. They were afraid of direct light. I took a slow step forward, keeping the beam steady. The shadow slithered backward, retreating into the darker corners of the hallway. I exhaled sharply. This wasn't just a theory. Light hurt them, not just any light, focused light. The dim glow of the emergency bulbs wasn't enough to keep them back. I needed something stronger, the backup generators. If I could restart them, I could bring back the main facility lights, flood the entire building with brightness. I gripped my flashlight tightly and started moving. The maintenance room was across the facility, past the warehouse floor. That meant crossing open space, and that meant risking everything. As I crept through the corridors, I kept my flashlight moving, scanning every corner, every crevice where shadows could hide. The emergency lights flickered overhead. With each flicker, the darkness twitched. They were waiting for the lights to fail, waiting for their chance. I pushed forward, my heart hammering in my chest. Finally, I reached the warehouse entrance. I stepped inside, then stopped cold. The entire warehouse floor was wrong. The shadows were too long. Even with the weak emergency bulbs, the floor was crawling with moving darkness. They were everywhere, spilling from the bases of forklifts, stretching from behind stacked crates, writhing under the catwalks above, waiting, watching, testing. I took a careful step forward, keeping my flashlight raised. The moment the beam hit the ground, the shadows flinched back, but only slightly. They were learning. The dim emergency lights overhead flickered again. A soft whisper brushed against my ears. I didn't wait. I ran. The warehouse felt endless. My footsteps echoed off the concrete floor as I weaved between crates and machinery. The flashlight beam cut through the dark, keeping them at bay but barely. Behind me, the shadows shifted in sync with the flickering lights, lunging forward whenever the illumination weakened. They were closing in. I forced myself to move faster, my lungs burning, my legs screaming in protest. Finally, I saw it, the maintenance door. I practically threw myself against it, fumbling with my keycard. A low whispering slithered across the floor behind me. I turned, just in time to see a mass of shadows surging forward. I swiped the card. The lock clicked open. I lunged inside and slammed the door shut. Darkness pounded against the other side, writhing, pushing against the cracks, trying to slip through. But it couldn't. Not yet. The emergency light in the room was still on. I had minutes, maybe seconds. I turned toward the backup generator. It was a massive, rusted machine, humming faintly, like it was struggling to stay alive. I didn't know much about generators, but I knew one thing: if this thing failed, I was dead. I scanned the control panel. Manual override. That was my shot. I grabbed the lever and pulled. Nothing. I pulled again, harder. The generator groaned. A low whir vibrated through the room, and then the lights came back. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a horrible screeching sound ripped through the facility. I stumbled back, covering my ears as the shadows outside the door convulsed violently. They weren't just retreating, they were writhing in agony. The overhead lights flooded the warehouse, the hallways, every room with pure, blinding brightness. The darkness collapsed in on itself, shuddering, pulling back into the smallest spaces it could find. They were still there, still waiting, but they couldn't move. Not in this light. I took a shaky breath. My hands were trembling. I had bought time, but this wasn't over, because I had seen something else, something worse. Before the generator kicked in, before the shadows screamed, I had seen movement, not from them, from something else. For just a split second, in the final moment of total darkness, I had seen a figure, standing in the middle of the warehouse, watching me. It hadn't been a shadow. It had been something else entirely. And then, when the lights had returned, it was gone. I swallowed hard. The generator wouldn't last forever. And whatever I had just seen, whatever had been standing there in the dark, it was still here, waiting for the lights to go out again. The hum of the backup generator filled the air, a rhythmic, mechanical pulse that barely masked the whispers outside. I stared at the door, my heart hammering. The shadows were retreating, shrinking into the tightest corners, curling away from the brutal fluorescent lights that now flooded the warehouse. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. Not them, not the shadows, something else. I had seen it just before the generator roared to life. A figure, standing perfectly still in the total darkness. And then it was gone. I exhaled sharply, trying to force my pulse to slow down. Focus. You're still alive. That's all that matters right now. But for how long? I turned to the control panel, scanning the system status. Fuel reserve, 19%. The number flickered, then dropped to 18%. My stomach turned to ice. This generator wasn't going to last. When it failed, the shadows would come back. And whatever I had seen in the dark, whatever had been standing there, it would be waiting. I needed a way out. The main entrance was blocked. I had seen the shadows swarming it on the monitors earlier. That left one option, the loading bay doors. If I could make it there, I could get outside, find a vehicle, anything to put distance between me and this place. I gritted my teeth. One problem at a time. The warehouse was still a minefield. The overhead lights were keeping the shadows pinned, but they were everywhere. A tangled mess of darkness coiled between crates and forklifts, stretching under conveyor belts. I had to be careful, because if the power cut out while I was out there— No, don't think about that. Just move. I gripped my flashlight and stepped out of the maintenance room. The warehouse buzzed with the sound of the overhead fluorescence, a harsh, sterile hum that somehow made everything feel even more unnatural. I took slow, deliberate steps, scanning my surroundings. Everywhere I looked, the shadows twitched, barely contained by the light. They weren't retreating anymore. They were waiting. I kept moving. The loading bay was on the other side of the warehouse. I had to weave through the maze of equipment and storage racks, keeping to the center of the light. Halfway there, I heard it, a sound from behind me, not the shadows, something else. I turned slowly, my breath catching in my throat. The warehouse was silent, But something was wrong. The storage crates, one of them had moved. I knew this warehouse. I had walked past this row dozens of times. The crates had always been stacked neatly, unmoved for months. Now one was slightly tilted, like something had shifted behind it. I swallowed hard and took a step back. Then the lights flickered, just for a fraction of a second. But in that moment, I saw it. Something huge, something wrong. It was crouched between the crates, pressed into the darkness like it was part of it. Not a shadow, something worse. I only caught a glimpse, too many limbs. A shape that didn't make sense. And then the lights stabilized. The thing was gone. I staggered back, my stomach twisting into knots. No, it wasn't gone. It was still there. It was just waiting for the lights to go out again. I ran. I didn't care about being quiet anymore. I sprinted toward the loading bay, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my grip. Behind me, the warehouse felt alive. Shadows shifting, the air buzzing, the generator's low hum a countdown to my death. The loading bay doors came into view. Locked. I swore under my breath and scanned the wall. There, a manual override lever. I grabbed it and yanked down hard. A loud clank echoed through the warehouse as the doors began to rise. Too slow, way too slow. Behind me, the lights flickered again. I turned and saw it. The thing that had been hiding. It was standing now, tall, too tall. Its limbs were long, spindly, folding and unfolding in ways that didn't make sense. Its face, if it had one, was wrong. A stretched, shifting void where features should have been. It didn't move toward me. It didn't need to. It was waiting, because the lights were going out. The generator was failing. I turned back to the loading bay doors. Halfway open. Not enough. I forced myself through, sliding under the gap just as the lights cut out completely. For a split second, just before darkness swallowed everything, I heard a low, rattling breath behind me. And then I was outside. I staggered into the parking lot, gasping for air. The sky above was an inky black void. No stars, no moon. But the warehouse was now pitch dark inside. The floodlights outside didn't turn on. I turned to look and saw movement inside. Dozens of shifting figures pressed against the open bay door. Shadows crawling, twisting, unfolding. And at the center of them, the thing that had been hiding, no longer bound by the light, no longer waiting, it stepped forward. Its form still shifting, writhing, bending, and the shadows followed. I ran. The parking lot was a maze of abandoned cars, their windows blacked out, their interiors swallowed by pure darkness. I darted between them, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind me, the warehouse groaned, metal twisting, glass shattering, as if something massive was pushing through. I didn't dare look back. The main road was ahead. If I could just... A figure stepped out of the shadows. I skidded to a stop. It was a man, the same man from before, the one who had smiled at the camera. Except now, his shadow was gone. He grinned at me. "You shouldn't have seen them," he said. The shadows rushed forward, and then the world went black. The world was black. I was awake, but I couldn't see. I gasped, stumbling backward, my hands reaching out, searching for anything. But there was nothing, just emptiness. The man had been there, smiling, speaking. Then darkness swallowed everything. Was I outside? Still in the parking lot? I turned, heart hammering, but the ground beneath my feet felt wrong. Not asphalt, not concrete, something cold, damp, something shifting. My breath caught in my throat. No, I was outside. I had made it out. Hadn't I? I fumbled for my flashlight, flicking it on. Nothing. The beam didn't work. Not because the flashlight was dead, but because there was nothing for the light to touch. The darkness around me was too thick, too dense, like I was trapped inside something solid. I swallowed hard. I had to move. I took a step forward. The ground shifted under me. It wasn't ground at all. It was shadow. I tried to steady my breathing, pushing the panic down. "Hello!" My voice barely carried. The air swallowed it up, like the space itself was too heavy to let sound travel. Then a whisper. Behind me. "You shouldn't have seen them." My body went rigid. The voice was close. Too close. I turned, and he was standing there. The man from the security camera. His smile was unchanged, but now it was wrong. He had no shadow, and neither did I. I stumbled back. "Where am I?" I demanded. The man's smile widened. "You're in their world now." The words sent an icy chill down my spine. I turned, searching for any sign of the warehouse, the parking lot, anything recognizable. But there was nothing, just an infinite void of shifting darkness. "Let me out," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I don't belong here." His expression didn't change. "Oh, but you do." My chest tightened. "No," I shook my head. "I'm not supposed to be here." He tilted his head slightly. "Then why did you look?" I opened my mouth, but no words came out. Why had I looked? Because it didn't make sense. Because the shadows moved when they shouldn't have. Because the lights had flickered at the wrong time. Because my mind told me something was wrong. He took a slow step forward. "You shouldn't have seen them," he repeated. I backed away, heart pounding. "I didn't have a choice." "You always have a choice," he murmured. Another step. I tried to move, but something tightened around my legs. I glanced down. The shadows were curling around me, like living tendrils, rising up from the shifting ground. I struggled, but the more I moved, the tighter they became. The man watched, not moving, not blinking, just waiting. And then he raised a hand. The shadows surged. Pain. Not physical, something deeper. A tearing sensation, like something was peeling me apart piece by piece. I screamed. The darkness wrapped around my arms, my chest, sinking into me, like it was pulling something out. I gasped, choking on nothing. The man took another step forward. "You can still give in," he said. I could barely hear him over the roaring void swallowing me whole. I clenched my teeth, fighting back. "Let me go," he sighed. "You really don't understand, do you?" His smile faded. For the first time, his expression shifted. There was something else beneath it, something like pity. "You can't leave," he said. "Not anymore." "No," I shook my head, forcing the words out. "That's not true." He let out a slow breath, and then he stepped aside. I froze. Behind him, the darkness shifted. A shape began to form. A figure. At first, it was featureless, just a mass of writhing black, humanoid but wrong. And then I realized I was looking at myself. I felt my stomach drop. It was me, same height, same build, but the face was blank. No eyes, no mouth, just a smooth, void-like surface. I took a step back. What is this?" The man gestured toward the figure. "This is your replacement." My mouth went dry. "What?" He smiled again. "You looked into the dark, and the dark looked back." I shook my head. No, I got away. I ran." You ran from shadows." His voice was calm. "But you didn't run from what made them." Couldn't breathe. The figure stepped forward. It moved like me, its posture, its gait, everything. I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. I could only watch. The man's voice softened. "You don't exist anymore." I clenched my fists. "No," I whispered. "Yes." His eyes darkened. "You're here now, and it's out there." My heartbeat slammed against my ribs. The figure turned, and then it walked away, straight into the darkness, straight into the real world. It was going to take my place. I lurched forward, trying to stop it, but the shadows yanked me down. I hit the ground hard. The last thing I saw was the man watching me, and then he smiled. The darkness swallowed everything. I was falling, not through space, not through air, through something else, something thick and endless, a darkness that stretched beyond understanding. There was no gravity, no sense of direction, just the sensation of being pulled downward into nothing. I twisted, trying to move, but the shadows clung to me like tar, wrapping around my arms and legs, holding me in place. Somewhere above or below or all around, I heard his voice. "The man without a shadow. You don't belong in that world anymore," he said. "You belong here." I clenched my teeth, fighting against the pull. "No," I snarled. "I'm not staying here." A low chuckle. "You still don't get it," he said. "You're not trapped. You're just misplaced." I forced myself to breathe, pushing the fear down. "Where am I?" "You're in the space between shadows," he said simply. "The place where they come from." I swallowed hard. The space between shadows. My stomach twisted. I was inside it, inside the thing that had been lurking at the edges of my vision, hiding in the corners of the warehouse, watching. I forced myself to stay calm. There had to be a way out. I just had to find it. The falling stopped, not suddenly, more like I had drifted into something denser, a place where movement no longer mattered. The shadows around me shifted, pulling apart, and suddenly I could see. Not much, just vague shapes forming in the endless blackness. And then I saw it. I saw him, the other me. He was standing there, just a few feet away. At first, he was still that featureless void, a shadow molded into my shape. But as I watched, his face started to change. The blankness rippled, features forming. Eyes, a nose, a mouth, not perfectly, not all at once, like a person learning how to smile for the first time, like something trying to become me. The worst part, he was getting better at it. I took a step forward. Stop! My voice came out shaky. The other me tilted his head. Then he smiled. It was a perfect copy of my own expression. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. What are you? I whispered. His head twitched slightly. My voice came back at me. I am you. No, this wasn't real. I clenched my fists. You're not me. He took a slow step forward. I will be. My breath hitched. I turned to the man without a shadow. Tell me what's happening, I demanded. He just watched, waiting, like this was some test, like he wanted to see what I'd do. I turned back to the other me, and then I lunged. I tackled him, my hands gripping his shoulders, shoving him back. But he didn't fall. His body barely moved. It was like pushing against something that wasn't really there. His hands closed around my arms. And then pain, not physical, something deeper, like he was pulling pieces of me away. I gasped, staggering back. He let go, but something was missing. I could feel it, like a part of me had been peeled away. The other me straightened, his face more complete now, more like mine. I clutched my chest, breath ragged. What are you doing to me? His smile widened. Replacing you. I turned to the man without a shadow, panic rising. How do I stop this? His eyes flickered with something unreadable. Figure it out, he said. My fists clenched. I didn't have time for this. The other me was already stepping forward again, his movements more natural now. I backed away. Think. If this thing was replacing me, if it was stealing pieces of me to become me, then I had to take them back. I took a deep breath, and then I did the opposite of what my body told me to do. I stepped toward him. His movements faltered for a fraction of a second. That was all I needed. I grabbed his wrist and pulled. The moment my fingers closed around his arm, the world blurred. A rush of memories flooded back into me. Flashes of my life, the warehouse, the emergency alert, the feeling of something watching, and underneath all of that, a deep, hollow hunger. I stumbled back, gasping, as the other me staggered. His face was glitching, rippling like a reflection in water. I had taken something back, but it wasn't enough. He lunged forward again. I fought. I grabbed at him, pulling back every missing piece of myself. With every second, he became less real. His face distorted. His body flickered, becoming more shadow than man. I was winning, and then the man without a shadow moved. For the first time, he acted. He reached forward, gripping the other me's shoulder, and with an effortless motion, he ripped him away from me. The shadow form twisted, shrieking in silence, and then it was gone. I collapsed to my knees, gasping. The darkness around us shifted, the heavy weight of it lifting slightly. I looked up at him. Why? I rasped. His expression was unreadable. You were close, he said, but not fast enough. I clenched my fists. I was winning. His smile returned. Were you? I exhaled shakily, forcing myself to stand. What happens now? His gaze didn't waver. You go back. I felt my chest tighten. To my world. His eyes darkened. To his. Before I could speak, before I could even protest, the shadows around me collapsed inward. And then I was falling again. I woke up gasping for air. Cold concrete pressed against my back. The dull hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. I blinked rapidly, adjusting to the brightness. I was back. I was in the warehouse. For a moment, I just lay there, my body aching, my head spinning. Had it been a dream? No, the memories flooded back. The shadows, the other me, the man without a shadow. the feeling of something being stolen from me piece by piece. I wasn't the same. I pushed myself up onto shaky legs. Everything looked normal. The security monitors still flickered in the background. The emergency alert broadcast still played on a loop, its robotic voice droning out its cryptic warning. Emergency alert. Beware of moving shadows. Avoid unfamiliar reflections. If you encounter a version of yourself behaving strangely, do not engage. I swallowed hard. The other me, the thing that had been replacing me, had I won, or had he? I staggered toward the exit, my body weak but still functioning. Every movement felt off, like I wasn't fully connected to my limbs, like there was a disconnect between my mind and my body. I reached the door and pushed it open. Cold night air rushed in and I froze. Someone was standing outside. A figure, a man, facing away from me. I recognized the posture, the shape of his shoulders. The way he stood, slightly shifted to one side. My blood ran cold. He turned, and I saw my own face staring back at me. I stepped back, my breath catching. No, he just stood there, silent, waiting. A slow, creeping horror settled in my chest. I had been sent back, but back to where? Or rather, had I been sent back at all? My mind screamed that something was wrong. He shouldn't be here. He should have been gone, destroyed. But he wasn't, because maybe I was the one who had been taken. Maybe I was the replacement. I took a shaky step forward. The other me didn't move. His eyes followed me, though sharp and unreadable. His expression was neutral, not hostile, just watching. I swallowed hard. "What are you doing here?" I whispered. His voice was my own, but off, like an echo of something once real. "I live here." My fingers clenched. "No, this is my life, my body, my world." A slow blink. "Is it?" I took another step forward. Something about him, the way he stood, the way his shadow stretched in the wrong direction. Too long, too thin. I was sure I had beaten him, but now I wasn't so sure at all. I needed proof, something to tell me who was real. I glanced around the parking lot, my mind racing. My phone, if I could just check my messages. Something, anything that grounded me to reality. I reached into my pocket. It wasn't there. Panic rose in my throat. I patted myself down, checking every pocket. Nothing, but he had a phone in his hand. My phone. I swallowed hard. "Give it to me." His fingers curled around it, holding it tight. "You don't need it anymore." My body went rigid, because I knew with horrifying certainty what had happened. I wasn't me anymore. I had been sent back, but I had been sent back wrong. Something was missing or something had been added. And now there was no way to prove who was who. We were both real, and we were both fake. I felt the night air press around me, thick and suffocating. The other me took a step closer. "Let it go," he murmured. My heart pounded. No, I couldn't just let it go. I needed to know. I needed to be sure. Because if I walked away, if I just let this happen, how would I ever be certain that I was real? Or worse, that I wasn't just a shadow in a stolen body? The silence stretched between us. Then the other me smiled. It was a perfect copy of my own expression. And somehow that was the most terrifying thing of all. "I guess it doesn't matter," he said softly. I took a step back. "It does," he shrugged. "Maybe to you." A pause. Then he turned and walked away, just like that, like he had already won, like it was over. I wanted to stop him. I wanted to make him prove who he was, who I was, but I didn't. I just watched as he disappeared into the darkness. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if I was watching someone leave, or if I was watching myself walk away. The emergency alert droned on. Avoid unfamiliar reflections. If you encounter a version of yourself behaving strangely, do not engage. I stood there, the words sinking into me. Had I engaged? Had I made a mistake? Or had I done exactly what the warning was trying to prevent? I stared at my hands, at the faint shimmer of darkness clinging to my fingertips. Something left behind, a mark, a reminder. And I realized it didn't matter if I was the real one or not, because no matter what, something had already changed. I was different now, and no one would ever know, not even me.